When I was at the University of Mary Washington's Second Amendment Day up in Virginia earlier this year, I had the pleasure to meet Logan Metesh, who, well, I didn't really know who he was at the time, but he was talking about historical firearms that were made in Virginia. And so I knew he was a historian of some sort. And then later, when we all went out to dinner, I discovered that he didn't anymore, but he used to work at the NRA Museum. And so when I knew that he was a historian and he got to handle some of the guns in the museum, I just knew that Weird would want to talk to him. And so when I got Logan's card, I handed it over to Weird, and I said, you probably want to interview this guy. And to be completely honest, I thought you would interview him for Handgun Radio, because I thought you would geek out about, moldy old revolvers or whatever. I'm really surprised that you spoke to him for this podcast.
To be fair, we've got a Handgun Radio show in the works. But yeah, so...
You just spoke to him for hours, didn't you?
Oh, it was probably an hour. But yeah, when I contacted him, he was very interested in doing the show. He was super excited about it. So I said,
you're welcome.
Yeah. Is there anything in particular you want to talk about? And he said, I'm open to anything. Those are some dangerous words. So I thought about it for a little while, and I thought a great subject to talk about, specifically for this show, is the works of John Pedersen. So joining me now is arms historian and proprietor of High Caliber History, Logan Metesh. How you doing, Logan?
I'm doing wonderful. How are you today?
I'm doing great. So Erin met you out in... Did she meet you in Salt Lake City?
No, we met in Virginia at a thing called 2A Day at the University of Mary Washington.
Yes. I couldn't remember which one of her travels she met you on, but she spoke the world of you. So I reached out and asked if you wanted to be on the show, and you said you would. And I said, anything particularly interested to talk about? And you literally said, anything you want to talk about. And
that's right.
Yeah, for those that know me, especially those who listen to Handgun Radio, you know that old moldy firearms are a bit of a fetish of mine. And so, yeah, that's not a good thing to say. You turned me loose in a candy store. And so I kind of racked my brain a little bit, and I said, how would you feel about talking about the works of John Pedersen? And I say that because I'm a 1911 guy. I'm carrying a 1911 right now. I love John Browning. I will speak the world of John Browning. But in the world of John Browning, it seems that always right there in his shadow, and I would say almost to the point where far too many people have no idea who I'm talking about, is John Pedersen.
Yes, absolutely. And it's such a linked relationship between John Pedersen and John Moses Browning, as we'll get to as we go through his career. But it's hard to argue with John Moses Browning. You can't really argue with a man whose middle name is Moses. But he once said that Pedersen was the greatest gun designer in the world. You stop and think about that for a minute. You think, my God, John Moses Browning said that someone else was a better gun designer than him. And he said that mainly because at the time in his life when he was making that comment, that he had pretty much done all of his inventing and Pedersen's career was ahead of him. And they paralleled their careers in a lot of different ways, in that John Moses Browning did a lot of his work with Winchester, focused most of his stuff, just at one company for the vast majority of his career. And John Pedersen did a very similar thing, but with Remington. And there's a lot of his designs ended up getting picked up by Remington. There's some military attempts in there, but really the main undertone to it all is Remington, and that's where the bulk of his work comes from. And so he's coming out with a lot of really innovative designs. Definitely one of his coolest designs and the most successful designs was what became the Remington Model 12, which was a pump action 22 gallery rifle, if you will. Incredibly popular design in the early 20th century at different shooting galleries and carnivals and things of that nature. And a staggering number of those guns made. They made more than 800,000 of them, which is no small feat. I mean, that is a testament itself to the popularity of that design. And so that's his rimfire design. But then he wants to go on and compete in the centerfire market. And so the natural gun that you're going to have to compete against in that time frame is going to be the Winchester 1894, which of course is a John Browning design. So there go their professional careers intertwining with one another. And so they beef it up to a centerfire design, and the Model 12 becomes the Model 14. And so he's known mainly for his long gun designs, and we'll get into his Patterson rifle and stuff like that. Well, you know what? Actually, let's get into his Patterson rifle right now.
Yeah.
So his Patterson rifle is a really neat design in that it's got a toggle lock action, kind of like a Luger pistol, which is something that you don't really see or think of being an effective design on a long gun, but that's what he incorporated into his gun, and he came up with his own cartridge as well. It was the 276 Pedersen, and in order to get those all to feed properly, they actually had a wax coating on the cartridges so that they would feed and extract properly. And it's important to keep in mind that this is around the same time where John Garand is creating what becomes the M1 rifle. And so these guns are kind of neck and neck in trying to figure out what is going to be the next gun.
I mean, it's my understanding that the Pedersen rifle directly competed with the Garand.
Yes, it absolutely did. But here's where the military goes for cost savings, and they're replacing the M1903 and M1917 bolt action rifles, which were 30-06. And of course, the M1 rifle is also in 30-06, and so it became a no-brainer kind of for the military to look at it and go, well, we've already got a ton of this particular caliber laying around. Why should we switch to a firearm that is a totally different proprietary cartridge? And so, government being government, it just made most sense for them to switch to what becomes the M1 rifle, John Garand's design, and to avoid the Pedersen design to have to deal with all sorts of retooling and new ammo manufacturers and things like that.
And I got to understand with that extraction issue that the gun had, so that it needed that wax coating, it probably couldn't be rebarreled into something else. Because I mean, there's a ton of popular military rifles that started out in calibers that you might not expect. But this was probably not one of those that could be easily adopted to another cartridge.
Yeah, I think the design was specific enough that, if he felt the need to come up with his own cartridge to go with the design, I think that probably speaks to the design. I think if John Pedersen felt the gun could have operated proficiently and to its full potential in 30-06, he probably would have chambered it in that cartridge. Mm-hmm. Again, I don't know for sure, but it seems that would make sense to me anyway. But so because it doesn't get that military contract, the gun's fairly rare. He ends up licensing the design to Vickers over in the UK, and they only make about 200 of them. So if you ever come across a Pedersen rifle or even a Pedersen cartridge, they're both cool, and gun guys tend to be cartridge guys too, and there's a lot of cartridge collectors. But it's a neat design, and it just unfortunately didn't really go anywhere. And that's both a testament to how his career goes in general. He's right there on the cusp, but never quite makes it. But it's also a testament to John Garand and his rifles, because Pedersen ended up creating in very small numbers, like less than 25 or so, of what were called the GX and GY rifles. And they were basically straight up copies of the M1 rifle with a few different tweaks to the design that he thought would improve on them, but it didn't go anywhere. That didn't make it into a military contract either. So It's, again, just one of those things. Even though he was a powerhouse, he kind of sits in the shadows of Browning and Garand. And so it's a little unfortunate for him. But again, he still has a fantastic career. He's mainly known for his long guns, but he also developed some handguns as well. Primarily the one that he's most well known for, and that will tend to be in the forefront of people's minds because of Remington's botched attempt to reintroduce it.
I'm glad you said it.
Someone had to say it, right? But so a few years ago, you may remember that Remington tried to reintroduce the Model 51, R51. And things didn't go so well for them. But the original R51 in .380 and to a lesser degree in .32 was actually a very successful handgun in their lineup, but it doesn't catch on, and it doesn't have the staying power that some of the other guns did in that time frame, and it certainly didn't carry well into the 21st century when they tried to redesign it and keep the same name. But an interesting aspect of that R51 design, the original design, I mentioned that it was chambered in .380 primarily, but they redesignated it the R53 when they introduce it in .45 ACP. And the goal for this is that it's supposed to compete against Browning's 1911. And he finally gets these guns up and running and everything squared away in 1917, hoping to get some military trials, and it goes well for him, but it's too little too late. You know, we're already in the throes of World War I. We've got all these companies that have tooled up to create 1911s.
Yeah, this was already after the acceptance. This was not part of the original trials gun where the 1911 went up against the Savage and the Luger.
That's correct. Yeah, the trials had already been concluded years before, and so it was too little too late. It took him a little longer to get things ready for prime time, if you will, and he just kind of missed the boat and didn't get things in order fast enough, which is unfortunate because the military enjoyed the gun. They really thought it was a good design, but again, it just didn't quite hit the mark, and he's just a little behind the eight ball on that, as he was with a lot of stuff in his career, which is terribly unfortunate for him because he was such a fantastic designer. And Pedersen's career is an incredibly long one, and if you know anything about him, you know that there's some really interesting, influential pieces that we haven't covered yet, but I'm watching the clock here, and I see that we're running a little long on time. So if you know what those guns are that we haven't talked about, well, then there's your little sneak peek for our next segment. And if you don't, well, I'm going to leave you hanging with a pretty cool cliffhanger. So make sure you tune in next time to learn about the rest of Pedersen's career.
Oh, thank you so much, Logan. This is super interesting stuff. I can't wait to keep talking about it. So that's Logan Metesh from High Caliber History. Thank you so much, Logan.
Thanks for having me.